Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Adult Bible Fellowship. We're studying how the story ends, taking a look at the end times information in the Bible. And what I've been trying to make a case for over the last several weeks is that the end of the story is actually the end of the story of Israel. And because of that, we need to understand a little bit about the history of Israel and how they got to where they got to and the different twists and turns in their nation's history so that we can understand what the end of the story is all about, what the book of Revelation is all about. And contrary to popular opinion, the book of Revelation and the end of the world is not just about Christians. It's not just about the church. We sort of jumped into the story late in the game, and even though that was always God's intention, God still has some stuff that he has to resolve with Israel, and that's why understanding Israel's story is so essential to understanding the last part of your Bible, and honestly to understand where the story of humanity is headed and where the end times is going to drop us. And if we truly understand Israel's history, then we'll understand what God is doing, and we'll also understand why he does the things that he does. And I think it'll just make more sense. I have some new notes for you that I am putting out on the internet on our church's website under the resources tab. You should have some brand new notes for this week. And probably the notes are going to cover at least this Sunday and next Sunday's material. And then I'll put some new notes up for after that. But I really want to cover this with you. And I really want to help you to see how the various pieces of the puzzle in the Old Testament help us understand the stuff that we get later on in the New Testament. When Jesus tells us about the end times, he's telling us about the end times in the context of the story of the nation of Israel. And also, John in the Revelation is doing the exact same thing. So let's understand a little bit about the Old Testament, the story of the nation of Israel, in order to understand where we're headed, okay? And I did this last week by introducing to you the concept of the Abrahamic covenant, coming out of the book of Genesis, chapters 12, 15, 17. It's really developed in the entire book, but specifically in those chapters, God makes promises to Abram. He makes promises to Abram. And let me just kind of review a little bit about these promises that he makes, because this agreement, this covenant, this pact, that God makes with Abram is so important, because really it sets the tone, it sets the table for the rest of the story of the Bible. If you jump into the middle of the story of the Bible and you try to understand the rest of the Bible and you have no understanding of the Abrahamic covenant, then you're going to fall woefully short of full understanding about what you're actually reading. If you're a Christian and don't know anything about Israel, can you accept Jesus into your life to forgive you for your sins? Yes. But if you think that Jesus died on the cross simply to forgive individual people of their sins, then you're missing out on the story. In fact, Jesus' death on the cross makes much more sense when you place it in the context of what's happening to the nation of Israel going all the way back to the days of Abraham. So here's what the Abrahamic covenant was really all about. And this is all by way of review. I put it on the first few blanks there. There's actually no blanks. You'll just notice there's some bolded words in this opening review section. So the Abrahamic covenant is all about a formal beginning of Abraham's relationship with God. Now it's, instead of him just doing what God says and being friends with God and stuff like that, they've made a formal agreement. They've made it Facebook official. Like if you looked on Abraham's Facebook page, you would see he's in a relationship with Yahweh. Why? Because Yahweh and he had made this agreement, this covenant, this pact. And it also extends, apparently, beyond Abraham to his descendants. So this is not just God and a person having an individual relationship. This is God choosing to establish a relationship with a man who then will give birth to an entire nation or group of nations. And it's God is promising he's going to continue to be in a relationship, not just with Abraham during his lifetime, but with Abraham's children and children's children, children's children's children, all the way down throughout the ages. Now, here's the promises that God makes as a part of this agreement. Here's the promises. The promises include a nation, or I should say nations of descendants. Abraham is not just going to be a tribal leader of a few people. He is going to be the head of a nation of untold descendants. And these people are going to be lumped together with a common identity and heritage and history, and they are going to organize themselves into a nation. Now that happens, by the way, while they were slaves in the country of Egypt. That's when they multiplied to kind of gain nation status. Of course, it was such a horrible time for them serving as slaves that they probably didn't celebrate a whole lot. But when you read the story and you find out that the children of Israel multiplied exceedingly, so they were like the sand on the seashore in Exodus chapter 1, what you see is God being faithful to this first promise of the covenant. He's multiplied Abraham, a man who had no children until he was 100 years old. No children at all. Well, that's not true. He had one son at 87, but the son of promise came at 100. So at 100, he had 2 kids. And from those 2 kids come now untold thousands and perhaps even millions of people by the time of the Exodus. So that's the first part. But then there's also included in that not just a promise of a lot of descendants, but also a promise of a homeland. And this homeland is specific. It's the land of Canaan. God actually gives boundaries for it. God didn't intend to give Israel the whole world. No, he intended for the rest of the world to be inhabited by other nations. But the nation of Israel would have the right, the ownership, the right to live and to possess the land of Canaan, where Abraham is wandering in Genesis 12, 15 through 17. So, descendants, a homeland, and then also there's this sort of more vague term of blessing. Blessing. God says to Abram, I will bless you, and I will make you a blessing. So in other words, the blessing isn't just for Abram. The blessing is for Abram, and then Abram is supposed to take that blessing and pass it along to the rest of the nations in the world. He is blessed to become a blessing to other people. And eventually, eventually God says to Abram, listen, through you, Abraham, all the nations or families, he says, of the earth will be blessed. So it's clear. God's plan is to work through this chosen group of people, to make a covenant, an arrangement, an agreement with them where he promises to protect them and to bless them. And then the idea is that as he pours his blessing into this nation of people, planted in the land of Canaan, that blessing will then spread from the land of Canaan all throughout the known world, and all of humanity then will experience the blessings that God intended to give not just to Abram and his descendants, but to give Abram and his descendants and then share that blessing with the rest of the world. This is God's redemption plan. This is how God is going to get the world back after losing it in the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3. He's going to use this nation of people to call the world back to God so that God can then, through his people, bless them and share the blessings that he always intended to give to humanity. Okay? Now, something else about this covenant that's really important that the text makes a big deal about is that it's an everlasting covenant. It's everlasting. In other words, this is a covenant that there's no expiration date on this. There's no shelf life, right? Like when I'm going through and looking through and I want a bagel and I look on the package of bagels and it says it's expired, theoretically, a normal person might throw that away, right? Because who knows? Maybe the bagel's not good anymore. The bagel's only good for a certain amount of time. Now, if you know my love of bagels, you know that usually I don't care about that, but most people would. There's no expiration date on this covenant. In other words, if the people struggle, suppose it takes a long time to get to the point where these promises are fulfilled, it doesn't mean the promises are null and void. The promises remain in place forever. This is a big deal. Because there's lots of times, and we're going to talk about this later today and next week, there's a lot of times in the course of Israel's history when they give God plenty of reasons to want to invalidate the covenants and say, sorry, you blew it, There's no reason for me to keep being good to you. You people are horrible to me. There's no reason for me to keep my side of the covenant. You keep breaking yours all the time. This covenant God is making is an everlasting covenant. It will never come to an end. It will never expire. And also, it's unconditional. In other words, this covenant was made by God with the understanding that I, God, in this case, is pulling the weight of this covenant. This is 100% on God. When Abram is trying to make this agreement, normally there would be a formal ceremony that would be enacted. And in fact, Abram gets it all ready. He cuts animals in half, and he separates the two animals and puts them kind of on the side. This is a really weird part of the story, okay? But stick with me because it makes sense in the context of that time. Abram takes a bull and like some birds and stuff, and he cuts all the animals down the middle, and then he separates them and leaves a space down the middle where you can walk. And the idea in the ancient society was you would do that to seal the covenant as a way to say, okay, it's official. Now, in our day, we have it notarized, right? You've seen that where you take it to the bank or you take it somewhere and a notary sees you sign it, they put their stamp on it, and now this is binding. This is a binding agreement. In those days, what they would do is they would cut animals in half, and then the two partners in the agreement, the two parties, would walk through the middle of those split animals, dismembered animals, and that would be the official signing on the dotted line, so to speak, that they were both bound to keep the covenant. And the idea is this, by the way, if you're grossed out by the cutting of the animals in half, I don't blame you. The idea is this: by walking through the middle of it, you're saying symbolically, may what happened to these animals happen to me. If I break the covenant, if I break my promises, may I be split in half the same way as these animals are split in half. And by walking down the middle, you're saying, I take upon myself the responsibility to keep my end of the bargain. And if I don't keep my end of the bargain, you are allowed to split me into the way these animals were split into. So that's kind of a commitment, right? That's kind of a big deal. You can't just kind of cross your fingers behind your back and go, see, fingers are crossed, doesn't count. No. This is a life or death kind of a thing. If you break your part, you will die. Now, here's the funny thing about the story of Abraham, though. Abraham, in Genesis 15, gets everything all set up, and it's nighttime, and he's waiting for God to show up, and presumably, he and God are going to pass through the middle of these animals, and they're both going to be bound to keep the covenant, right? It just sort of makes sense. It's how people settled business in those days. And God causes a deep sleep to fall on Abram. So he's passed out on the side of the road. He's passed out waiting for God to show up to walk down the middle of this path. And the text says that God himself, an appearance of his glory, passed between the pieces of the animals. Genesis 15, look it up. What is God saying? God is saying the responsibility to make sure that this covenant works rests 100,000% on my shoulders as God. In other words, the responsibility for keeping this covenant and making this deal work does not rest on the sleeping dude over there. He has no ability to break it, and he has no ability to keep it. He's just a guy. God takes upon himself the 100% commitment to make this relationship work. Now that's good news for Abram and for his descendants, because Abram and his descendants both prove considerably often that they aren't able to keep their side of the covenant. And if their side of the covenant gets broken, that could mean that the entire agreement is broken and then God is let off the hook, right? Because if you break your side in a two-way deal, if you break your side, then the other side is also allowed to break his with no consequences. But in this situation, God makes Abram pass out. God alone walks through the middle. So God is saying to Abram and to his kids, hey, guess what? I'm the one that's going to make sure that this comes to pass. Because remember, this whole idea was God's from the beginning. Why? Because God wanted to pass his blessing along to a world that had rebelled against him and run away from him. And so he's saying, look, I'm not going to leave it up to the loser over there to decide whether or not my plan comes true. The only neck on the line is going to be mine. And if I am unable to make this work, then you can split me apart like you split apart these animals. So God's coming right out there. And so he says, look, this is an unconditional covenant. Unconditional. And I will say this too. God is going to make other covenants with his people besides just the Abrahamic covenant. But these other covenants that come later are all kind of like sub-covenants under the larger covenant of the Abrahamic covenant. And some of these covenants that he's about to make are actually conditional, where there's back and forth, there's two-way streets involved. And so just because they break some of these sub-covenants does not mean that now God is off the hook in blessing his people the way he promised Abraham. Does that make sense? So the Abrahamic covenant is sort of like an umbrella. I want you to picture an umbrella, right? An umbrella. And underneath this umbrella are all of these other agreements and covenants that God makes with his people. And all these other covenants are sort of dependent upon the Abrahamic covenant in order to work. And the one we're going to talk about today is called the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant, for example, emerges from and is built on the understanding of the Abrahamic covenant. All other agreements that God makes with his people are all going to be based on the foundation of the Abrahamic covenant. And the Abrahamic covenant is like that solid rock that will never fall, that'll never fail. You know, like, it's the foundation. The house may get knocked over, even though it seems unlikely that you could destroy something as powerful and strong as a house. But that house can get destroyed. But underneath the foundation, the Abrahamic covenant, that stays and that stays forever. And in that covenant, God is determined to give Abram descendants, to give Abram a homeland, and to give Abram the blessing that then he can pass along to the rest of the world. Really big deal. So, today, I want to talk about a second covenant. A second covenant. Not the Abrahamic covenant anymore. We already talked about that. We're now talking about a sub-covenant. A covenant that happens underneath the auspices, underneath the umbrella of the Abrahamic covenant. And that second covenant we're going to talk about, I already gave you the name. It's called the Mosaic covenant. And by the way, if you're curious, the Mosaic covenant is roughly equivalent to what we think of when we hear, as Christians, the law. The law. The Jews would call that, by the way, here's a cool Jewish word, Hebrew word for you, the Torah. The Torah. But the Torah, you still got to remember, Mosaic covenant, the law, it's all under the umbrella of the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant forms the basis for it, and nothing that happens with the Mosaic covenant can undo the promises God made in the Abrahamic covenant. All right? Now, there's a couple of key passages that I want to take you to, because really, if you're going to talk about the Mosaic covenant, you could literally start teaching in Exodus, and you could teach all the way through Malachi, because it's all sort of included in this big idea of this major covenant or agreement, or as I call it, the deal that God cuts with Abram's descendants. Okay, but I'm just going to highlight a few key passages, and we are going to work through them in some detail, because I want you to understand what's going on with this Mosaic law thing, this Mosaic covenant. Why did they even have it? Because there's all these really weird mixed up ideas as to why God gave the law to his people. And I think it really causes some confusion. If you read the New Testament only and you don't read the Old Testament, sometimes you get the impression that God gave the people of Israel the Mosaic law to show them that they could never earn their salvation. That was the entire purpose of the Mosaic law, was to give them a standard that was so high to measure up to that they would always fall short and therefore be dependent upon God's grace. Now, that is true to some extent, but if you simplify the Mosaic covenant to only being some kind of a law or standard you can never meet so that you're humbled and you seek God for salvation, then you're missing the point. You're missing the point. Or at least I should say, you're missing some of the points. You may be getting one of the points, but you're missing like points 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, all of which are really, really, really important. God gave the Mosaic Law for a specific purpose. And let me try to explain why by inviting you to open up to Exodus chapter 19, okay? Exodus 19. As we go along, I'm going to be giving you blanks on some of the subnotes here, but there may be times that I step away from the notes for a little bit and teach, and then come back and give you the blanks, okay? So don't get freaked out. Those of you that are blanks people, I will get back to the blanks, I promise, if you're just patient and you stick with me, okay? So here we go. Exodus chapter 19, right near the beginning of your Bible. Exodus 19, let's start in verse 1. It says this, on the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt. Okay, got to pause for just a second. The context of Exodus chapters 1 through 18 tells the story about how a nation of slaves in Egypt, the descendants of Abraham, multiplied and became a nuisance to the pharaohs of Egypt. And so the pharaohs turned them into slaves. And the pharaohs then oppressed the people until the people cried out to the God of Abram, their father, and said, God, please deliver us from this slavery. And apparently this is going on. Thousands and thousands of people crying out to God, God, we're in slavery. We don't know what to do. We can't get ourselves out. Please, please help us, right? And if there's one thing the Bible teaches you is that when you cry out to God, that is exactly what gets God's attention. And so God's attention is gotten, so to speak. And when God's attention is gotten, then he turns back to the people. And he sends this guy named Moses. And Moses used to be the son of Pharaoh, or the grandson of Pharaoh, and he had a little issue with the law, and he ran away into the wilderness, and God grabs Moses and sends him back to his people, and he says, I want you to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Now, Pharaoh is not open to this concept, and so Pharaoh says, no, heck no, I'm not going to give you my slaves. They're building all my cities, and everything's great. It's very possible that the Jews are the ones that built the pyramids in Egypt that we see to this day. Maybe not, but certainly they were building cities and building monuments and building statues and building structures for the king. Chariot cities, things like that. Moses comes and says, let him go. Pharaoh's like, no way. So God says, fine, I'll make you. And that's when the 10 plagues hit. And the 10 plagues are designed to bring Egypt to its knees so that Egypt will let Israel go. Because God wants to take them back to their homeland, which is the second part of the Abrahamic covenant, right? Back to their homeland so that he can bless them. So he fights for them, and he basically busts them loose of the nation of Egypt. And if you remember the story, Pharaoh finally lets them go. They start marching towards the Red Sea. Right? They start marching towards the Red Sea. Pharaoh wakes up and goes, oh my word, I just sent away all my free slave labor. That's not smart. Now I'll have to hire people to do the job that I want them to do. I don't want to spend the money. So he chases after the children of Israel with his army. The Bible says that when the children of Israel got right up to the Red Sea, Pharaoh's army's coming in behind. God opened up a path through the Red Sea for his people to walk through safely. They walk through safely. They come to the other side. Pharaoh and his chariots and horsemen and soldiers rush through that open space, and then God causes the waters to collapse again on them and drowns them all. And in the process, God delivers his people. He sets them free. Now, I'll give you a couple blanks here. The Abrahamic covenant is the basis of God's rescue of Israel from Egypt. Okay? It's the Abrahamic covenant. Let me just point this out to you from verse 1. On the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to Moses, or to him, out of the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, verse 4, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. God's saying, look, do you remember what I just did for you in Egypt? The reason that I did that, the reason I set you free from Egypt is because I made promises to your fathers. I made promises to Abram, to Isaac, to Jacob. And when you called out to me as the children of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, I had to keep my promise and I had to bust you free. So the Abrahamic covenant is the basis for God's rescue of Israel from Egypt in something that's called the Exodus. That just means they all left, right? The Exodus. And that's here in verses 1 through 4. So then the children of Israel, what do? Well, they're free now, but they're in the desert. They're not at the homeland God originally wants to send them to. There's this in-between time. So they march until they come to this mountain called Sinai, and Moses goes up the mountain because he wants to meet with God, and God reminds his people, hey, I set you free, not because you did anything for me, right? Not because you made a great sacrifice or you were really holy, awesome individuals, right? Or you were really good obeying my rules. Because the truth is, there are no rules yet. When the children of Israel in Egypt, they're just living there. They have stories, they have legends, they have tales that their ancestors told them about a God who had blessed them. They cried out to that God for deliverance, and simply because of his love and mercy and because of the promises he made to Abraham, he goes and he busts them out of prison. And he takes them out into the wilderness. But now that they're in the wilderness, a new covenant needs to be made. Now, it's not a covenant to replace the Abrahamic covenant. It's a covenant that's going to flesh out in real life the blessings of the first covenant. Okay? So here we go. The second statement here says, the freed nation marches to Sinai where God proposes a second covenant, which is built on and fleshes out the promises of the first covenant, which is, of course, the Abrahamic covenant. Take a look at verses 5 and 6. So he says, I busted you out of Egypt. That's verse 4. Verse 5. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And he says to Moses, these are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So God comes to Moses and says, hey, Moses, here's the deal. I want to make a deal. I want to cut a deal with Israel, with the people that I just set free because of granddaddy Abraham and the promises I made to him. I now want to make a second covenant with his descendants who are down at the bottom of the mountain, who don't really have any clue what's next, right? Well, they're free, but now that they're free, now what? God says, here's the now what. We're going to make another covenant. And here's the deal. I'm going to make a deal with you. If you obey my covenant, if you keep my covenant, then I will make you my treasured possession. I will give you a place of prominence. You'll be my kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So in other words, God is, he's in very, very general terms at this point, is just saying, hey, if you do what I say, if you follow me, then I will take care of you and I will provide all the blessings in specific terms that I originally promised to Abraham. All those kind of nebulous, vague blessings, I'm going to convert them into something very specific you'll be able to measure if you obey mine. Now that's not an unconditional covenant, right? That's an if-then covenant. That's if you do your part, I'll do my part. And I'll do my part, so you better do your part. This is a conditional two-way kind of a covenant. Now, look at how the people respond. Look at verses 7 and 8. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to God. So the people's initial response to this is, God wants to establish a relationship with us. He wants to bless us and make us his treasured possession and make us his kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God wants to tell us what's next. Yeah, sign me up is basically what the people are doing here. But again, they don't know all of the implications of what's going to be in this covenant. What is it they're going to have to obey? Right here, they're just blanket statements saying, okay, we'll do it. Whatever you say is fine. Whatever you say. So Moses goes back up to God, tells him, hey, the people are willing. And God's like, tell you what, before we settle all this for good and seal the deal and, write on the dotted line, let me tell you a little bit about what's going to be involved in you obeying me and keeping my covenant. And so you have chapters 20, 21, 22, 23, and then part of 24, where God lays out the first kind of bits and pieces of this covenant, his expectations of them, what he's going to expect from them. And this is where we get the famous, probably the most famous part of the Bible to people that are not very familiar with the Bible, is the 10 what? The 10 suggestions? No, that's not right. That's not right. It's the 10 commandments. And it starts with verse 1 of chapter 20. God spoke all these words saying, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. It is not a coincidence, by the way, that he starts with that one. Okay? Because if you get that one wrong, all the other ones flow from that first one. God is basically saying the ultimate requirement of this covenant is 100% faithfulness. You worship me, you follow me, you love me, you devote yourself to me, you sacrifice to me, you live for me. You don't do any of those things for any other God. And let me tell you, there were thousands for the children of Israel to pick from. There were probably a bunch that they had worshipped in ignorance back in Egypt, because that's what the Egyptians worshipped. And God's like, no, if you want this covenant, if this covenant's going to work, it's going to be one God, me, and you. 100% complete loyalty and faithfulness. And then he delineates a lot of other things. And he starts to talk to them about all the different laws, about how you're supposed to handle this and how you handle that, what kind of altars to make, how do you make restitution if you end up taking something from somebody, social justice. You want to talk about social justice? God is very concerned about social justice, and he starts laying out the laws for a just society. And he's saying, look, if you're going to be in a relationship with me, you're going to be just. If you're going to be in a relationship with me, you're going to worship me on the seventh day, on the Sabbath. You're going to have these festivals. You're going to do all this stuff. It's really, really, really important. And the people are like, woo, cool. Now notice what happens here. Notice what happens here. In verse 24, verse 1, chapter 24, verse 1, he says this, and he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, that's his brother, Nadab and Abihu, that's Aaron's kids, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him. So verse 3, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. Okay? So in other words, Moses is telling people, God is telling people up front, hey, this is not going to be a walk in the park. This is not going to be exactly like the Abrahamic covenant, where I don't really expect anything from you. I'm taking 100% ownership to make sure this relationship works. This covenant, which is a subset of the original covenant, this covenant is going to be a lot about you following and obeying certain restrictions and rules. And I want you to know that up front. Before you sign on, you need to know what you're signing up for. So God gives them 4 chapters to illustrate the kinds of laws he was going to give them. And how did the people respond in verse 3? The same way that they did back in chapter 19. To their credit, because they realize what a great deal this is that God is proposing to them. And all the people answered and with one voice said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So what does Moses do? He writes them down. He puts them on a tablet. You may have heard this. And on the tablet, he inscribes the 10 commandments and all that stuff. And look down at verse 7. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. That's book of the covenant, by the way, is those 4 chapters between the 10 commandments and this right here. He's basically kind of laying it out for them. Hey, this is what it's going to involve. So God is being upfront and God is being honest with them. And then look at verse 8. Oh no, verse 7. So he reads it to them, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. So 3 times the people say, yes, sign me up. That's what I want to do. That's where I'm going to be. That's what I'm all about. I agree to the covenant. We're all in this. And it's not just 1 or 2 people on behalf of the whole nation. It's the whole nation hearing and the whole nation with one voice echoing, yes, we will do this. Nobody was forced to do a thing. This is willing. This is something they did of their own free will. And then look at verse 8. Verse 8. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." Now, what's going on there? That's another strange custom from the olden times that we don't totally grasp today. Well, you remember that when God sealed the deal with Abraham, there were animals that had to be killed. There was a cow that had to be cut in half and split apart. There were other animals as well. I think sheep and also birds that were cut in half and placed on opposite sides. And the blood that they spilled represented the lives of those animals. And the lives of those animals had to be taken in order for this covenant to take effect. Well, apparently, the Mosaic covenant works under a similar principle. There was a sacrifice made, some animal, we don't know which animal. Some animal was killed, and the blood was collected, and then the blood was sprinkled out on the people. And the blood symbolized the same concept that Abraham symbolized with the animals being split in half. The idea is this: may it come upon us. May our blood be shed if we break our part of the covenant. So the last blank that I want you to fill in here under this section is that a blood sacrifice is made to seal the covenant. This is the moment when the ink is on the dotted line. Literally, in this case, it's blood. It's written in blood. The blood of these animals are sprinkled on the people as their reminder that they have an obligation now. Their life is tied up in them keeping their promises. Okay, so that's Exodus. That's where it happens chronologically. Because of the Abrahamic covenant, for free basically, God busts his people out of slavery. Doesn't expect a thing from them. He just does it out of his own kindness, his own grace, his own love. For reasons simply because he wanted to keep his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But then he brings them to the mountain and says, okay, if you guys want to grow up now, you don't want to be babies the rest of your life, we're going to make a new deal. And this new deal doesn't cancel out the old deal, but it's sort of a way for the first deal to be fleshed out in everyday life. And it's built on that original deal. And I am going to show you something that if you are willing to do this, then I will bless you like this. And the people say, whew, sign me up, sign me up. And this is the moment here in Exodus 24, that the nation becomes a nation in truth. Okay? Then the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, and most of Numbers is God giving them more instructions, right? They need a little bit more. The 4 chapters in Exodus help, but they only kind of get you started. They need instructions about how to worship. They need instructions on how to live with one another. They need instructions on how God wants them to take care of various social justice issues. And so he, over the next 2.5 books, he basically crafts a constitution for them that teaches them how they're supposed to engage and how they're supposed to behave. And then you come to the book of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is interesting because it takes place 40 years have gone by since this moment in Exodus. This moment in Exodus when they received the law, probably a little bit more than 40 years actually, just over 40 years. And in the meantime, the children of Israel have been wandering in the desert for 40 years. It's a long story. I don't have time to get into it, but the generation that made this commitment right here basically didn't trust God enough to go into the homeland he gave to them. And so God said, as a punishment, you guys are going to wander outside the door for 40 years until you all die, and then your kids will go in. Your kids, who you were worried about dying in the land because you wanted to keep them safe and keep them protected, I'm going to show you that your kids are the ones that are going to inherit the blessings, not you. You're going to go die in the wilderness. Interesting. Full of all kinds of fun applications we can talk about some other time. But here's the deal. So here they are on the mountain, and Deuteronomy rolls around, and all of those kids now, who were little kids on Exodus 19, are now grown-ups. They've got grown teenagers of their own. And they're there, and they're ready to go into the land as God promised them. And before they do, Moses wants to make sure that they remember the lessons from the very first time when they first agreed to this covenant. And so the book of Deuteronomy means the second giving of the law. Okay? Deuteronomy is basically where Moses reminds the next generation of everything that God had done up until that point. He rehashes their whole history. He goes back over the promises the people had made to God. And then he talks about the promises that God had made to the people. And here's where we start to get some really interesting kind of like reflection upon this covenant. And we hear about more detail in Deuteronomy than you see in Exodus. So turn to Deuteronomy chapter 4. I want to read 5 verses. And in these 5 verses, I think we learn a little bit about what this Mosaic covenant is really all about. What's the purpose of it? Why has it been established? Take a look at verse 1 of Deuteronomy 4. And now, O Israel, he says, listen to the statutes and the rules that I am teaching you and do them. Why? Why should you do them? He says this, that you may live and go in and take possession of what? Of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. Verse 2, you shall not add to the word that I command you, nor take from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you. Verse 3, your eyes have seen what the Lord did at Baal Peor. That's what happened to their parents that caused them to be wandering around in the desert till they died. For the Lord your God destroyed from among you all the men who followed the Baal of Peor. Verse 4, but you who held fast to the Lord your God are all alive today. Right? The very first commandment of the law is loyalty, holding fast to him, not abandoning God for some Baal in the wilderness just because he seems to be offering something that God isn't offering to you. Verse 5, see, I have taught you statutes and rules as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the what? Land that you are entering to take possession of it. So you catch that? Twice he says, these rules that I'm giving you are instructions to help you know how you're supposed to live in the land that God is about to give you. In other words, these are the expectations God has for anybody who's going to live in the chosen, promised land. Take a look at the blanks here underneath Deuteronomy. You'll see it on page 1 there. It says, Moses makes it clear that this second command or covenant is specifically focused on the land, that's the first blank, that God is about to give the Israelites. Check this out. The stipulations in this covenant, in other words, the requirements, right? This is what you have to do, and this is what God will do in response. The stipulations in this covenant contain God's expectations. That's the second blank. God's expectations of how the Israelites must behave in exchange for the privilege of living in the land. That's the third blank. I want you to think of it this way. When we moved from Wisconsin to New York, we did not immediately find somebody who was willing to purchase our house, so we decided to have somebody live in it as a renter. And that renter had to sign an agreement before I allowed him and his family to move into the house that belonged to me. And there were many requirements and many rules and many statutes. And as long as my renter kept those requirements according to the standard of the law as we set it out in that covenant, because what was that agreement? The lease agreement. It's a covenant between two parties, right? And there will be consequences if either one of us breaks it. But I say, if you live up to these standards in the lease, then you have the right to live in my house. If you break the covenant, if you break the stipulations, if you don't live up to the expectations I, as the owner of this house, have for you, which is like paying rent on time, not destroying my property, not like, getting police called on you because you're having wild parties and things like that. If you keep the commandments, you can stay in my house. But if not, guess what? You're out of there. And I'll call the cops, and I'll give you proper notice, but after 30 days or 60 days, I can't remember what the thing is, you're out. Why? Because you didn't live up to the stipulations. You didn't behave in my house the way I wanted you to, and therefore, I have the right to kick you out of my house when you're no longer living up to that standard. Now, That is very, very essentially the same as what God is doing here in the Mosaic covenant with his people. He's saying this, look, the land of Canaan belongs to me. I'm the owner of it. And I have been letting the Canaanites live there right now. But now I'm going to move them out and I'm going to plant you in this land. This is now going to be the land that you're going to consider as your own. But don't you forget, Israelites, you don't own the land. The land is a gift from me to you. And if you want the right to keep living in the land, then you're going to have to live up to my expectations of people who live in my land. And the people who live in my land are people that are exclusively loyal to me, who worship as I say, who have judgments in society the way I expect, who treat each other the way I expect them to treat each other, and who just do certain things. When you live up to the standards in the agreement, I'll let you stay, and it'll be blessing, and we'll have a good relationship, and it'll be wonderful. If you don't pay your rent, in the sense of living up to these expectations I have of you, then at some point, I'm going to get fed up, and I'm going to give you your notice, and I could kick you out. Now again, kicking them out does not invalidate the Abrahamic covenant, but it means you no longer have the right to be in the land and to enjoy the land that I had promised to you. Okay? So the Mosaic covenant, also the law, is an agreement between God and the Israelites that tells the Israelites how they're supposed to behave in order to please God while they live in the land that God has given them. All right, next blank, next paragraph here. If the Israelites were good tenants of the land, by keeping God's expectations found in the law, they would get the attention of the nations around you. Take a look at what verse 6 says in Deuteronomy chapter 4. It says this, keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples. The peoples, who are the peoples? They're the people around them, watching them, the surrounding nations. Who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I set before you today? So here's the idea. Remember, Israel was meant to be blessed so that Israel could pass that blessing along to the nations, right? So here's the deal. God is saying this, if you keep your side of this covenant, if you're good tenants and you measure up to the expectations that I have of you, then the nations around are going to look at you and they're going to say, wow, those people are smart. They're wise. They're understand. Can you believe it? Their God lives with them. Their God gets along with them. They're not terrified of their God. They have a good relationship. They enjoy one another. They're his treasured possession in the entire world. Wow. Can you see? Can you see how the Mosaic covenant was intended by God to be a way to catch the attention of the surrounding pagan nations who needed God's blessing? Later on, much later on, there's a king by the name of Solomon who is so magnificent and so wise and so understanding that people come from all over the known world to try to find out his secret. And what better way to tell the world about the one true God that wants to love them and save them than to live differently enough that the world is impressed by what they see and come looking for answers. That's the genius of the Mosaic law. God gives his people a set of expectations and says, if you live up to these, the world around will pay attention and you will be able to accomplish your mission. And what's your mission? To be a kingdom of priests, to introduce the rest of the world to God. That was Israel's mission from the beginning. And the Mosaic law was meant to be the way that the people of Israel would live differently so the world would see and go, wow, I need to know that God the way Israel knows that God. So nations, that's what goes in that second blank there under Deuteronomy. They would get the attention of the nations around them, which would also enable them, by the way, would also enable them to fulfill the promise to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. And I'll say this, if Israel had the ability to keep their end of the bargain, it would have worked. it would have worked. It would have done exactly what God intended for it to do. The world would have come to know God through his people Israel as they lived up to this standard of his expectations, and they showed the world that a relationship with God changes the way you are. Sadly, it was not to be. And God knew it was not to be. So he had a backup plan. But first, you need to understand the first plan. Now, one more thing, and then we're going to be done for today. The next statement underneath Deuteronomy is this. This covenant, and it's just a review really of what we've already talked about. This covenant is conditional, right? So, Abrahamic covenant, unconditional. No matter what the Jews do, God is always going to be committed to them because of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God just bound himself in that covenant, and there's nothing that you can do to break him out of it. He can't even break himself out of his own covenant. He has to keep his word. But this Mosaic covenant is a conditional covenant. It's based off of your obedience to the expectations. And here's the deal. In other words, if the conditions are met by both sides, there will be specific, and then here's the blank, blessings. If you do what God says to do, then he's going to bless you. And the blessings are going to be very specific and concrete. And we're going to talk about that at the very beginning next week. But if the conditions are not met, then unfortunately for Israel, there are going to be specific curses that come along with it. Oh, this is the fun part, right? The fun part, not so much, but anyway, let's go with this. So, blessings if you fulfill, curses, punishments, judgments if you don't. But here's the cool thing about God. God gives it to them up front. God doesn't trick them into a deal and say, oh, by the way, once you've already committed thinking that it was all rosy, now if you guys step out of line, I'm going to crush you. And sometimes that's the impression people get of God, and it's a wrong impression. It's a false, faulty impression. It's a mistake. God is not playing games with us willy-nilly. God tells us ahead of time what he expects, and he also tells us the consequences of our behavior. The question is whether or not we listen and pay attention or not. And that's the question that I wonder with Israel, because God lays out in incredible detail both the blessings of obedience and the curses for disobedience. And again, remember, this is for Israel to be attractive to the nations so that Israel can prove by her actions she deserves to be in the land that God has given her, because she has a relationship with God that's different than the rest of the nations around. Next week, when we come back, we're going to talk about the rest of the issues here with the Mosaic covenant. We're going to build off of what we've already studied, and we're going to dive into looking at, okay, so what are these blessings? What are these curses? And how did it all play out in the nation's history? So I hope you'll come back with me next week and hit the next part of this understanding of the Mosaic covenant. See you next week.